We all know exercise is great for the heart. It's great to prevent heart disease. But what if you already have heart disease? Can exercise actually help us shrink existing plaque? Last year, we looked at a study that focused exactly on this question: exercise and plaque reduction. They basically took 60 patients, mostly men, with established heart disease, with plaque in their coronaries, the little arteries feeding blood to the heart muscle. They were all on the usual medical care with lipid-lowering treatment, with statins, all the usual stuff. And they split them randomly. One group received nothing else. The other group got an exercise program. They tested all their participants. They did a cardiopulmonary test on a treadmill. And the highest heart rate that they observed during that test, they defined as the peak heart rate. Don't confuse this with something that we sometimes see in the HIIT world, in the HIIT world, high intensity interval training, called maximum heart rate, which is usually defined based on a formula, depending on the person's age. And it's typically very high heart rate. That's why in HIIT, the training intervals are very short, usually 10 seconds, 30 seconds, something like that. This peak heart rate is something that is tailored for the individual, that is observed during a test. So it's adequate for each person and their limitations. So this program was an interval training cardio program, mainly treadmill or stationary bikes. It consisted of a 10-minute warm-up period, then the training proper, 4 cycles of 4 minutes, where they were supposed to stay between 85 and 95% of peak heart rate, that metric that was defined in their test. So peak heart rate was different for each participant, depending on their ability. And these 4-minute intense exercise periods are separated by 3-minute periods of less intense exercise at 70% peak heart rate. And then finally, a 3-minute cool down. So it is kind of like HIIT, high intensity interval training, but here these bursts of intense activity are longer. They performed this twice a week in the research setting with supervision, and they were also encouraged to do more exercise at home. And the trial lasted 6 months, and they measured plaque in their coronary arteries before and after using a technique called intravascular ultrasound. So ultrasound is essentially the same technique you get when you're pregnant, but in this case, it's inside the arteries. So there's a little tube, a little catheter that gets inserted into the person's arteries, and it can image the artery wall around it. And so you can get really good resolution of the artery wall and the plaque and all the features. Bottom line, after 6 months of the program, they did see a reduction in total plaque burden in the group receiving the exercise program of about 5%. They also had this other way of presenting the results called PAV, percent atheroma volume. It's basically what percentage of the artery is occupied by plaque, and that metric was reduced by about 1%. If these numbers seem small, consider that in trials with lipid-lowering treatment, a reduction of PAV of 1% corresponded to a reduction of actual risk of 20%. So actual heart attacks and strokes were reduced by 20% for each 1% reduction in PAV. The realization here is that a small change in plaque can actually result in a big change in blood flow and risk of events. Also, this was 6 months only. It's possible that if you do this for a year or 2 or 3, the results get more impressive. So this was the trial we covered last year. It was a really interesting trial because it shows that you add somewhat intense exercise on top of usual medical care, and you can not just help prevent heart disease, but actually reduce existing plaque. Now, this study left some questions open, like every study ever. For example, what about other types of exercise? Is this the only modality that works? Is this the only way to get the benefits? So I recently realized that the same team that published that study published a smaller trial 10 years ago with 36 patients, also mostly men, also with artery disease in their coronaries, also on usual medical treatment with lipid-lowering drugs and everything as usual. And they also split them in half, but here they put them on 2 different workouts. One was the same interval training of the recent trial. The other group did a continuous cardio program, a 46-minute session of walking or light running at 70% of their peak heart rate. And both exercises they did 3 times a week in this older trial. And very interesting, very important, they were isocaloric. So both of these exercises were done and were planned and designed so that they spent the same amount of calories on both. This trial lasted 12 weeks, so 3 months, and basically by the end, in both exercise groups, they saw a trend towards a reduction in total plaque burden that didn't quite reach statistical significance. It was right on the cusp. It's what we call borderline statistical significance, possibly because it was a smaller trial, fewer people, half the number of people, half the size. So it was less, they had less statistical power to pick up these changes. So it makes sense. Interestingly, in that older trial, they also looked not just at total plaque, but at the types of plaque. Plaque is not all the same. It's not all created equal. There's different types of plaque and different features inside of plaque. And some are more dangerous than others. Some are features of stable plaque that is less likely to rupture. And some are features of vulnerable plaque that is more likely to burst and cause events like heart attacks and strokes. So one thing they looked at is this feature of plaque called the necrotic core, which kind of sounds like a Marvel supervillain or something. And it sounds nasty because it kind of is. It's a part in the center of the plaque where there's cell death, and it's a feature of vulnerable plaque that is more likely to rupture and cause an event. And in fact, they saw a reduction of the size of the necrotic core in both groups, both types of exercise, statistically significant reduction in both, and there was no significant difference between them. So it suggests that the reduction is about similar in both groups. Bottom line, when we put together all the little pieces of the puzzle, it looks like both workouts deliver the goods. So if someone doesn't like HIIT for some reason, this interspersed, more intense workout, continuous cardio seems to deliver roughly the same benefit, at least if you match for total calories. Okay, how would exercise even do this? How does exercising reduce the plaque inside the artery wall? It's kind of a fascinating question. There's different ideas out there. One that I've seen put forward in the scientific literature is that the increased blood pressure, the increased blood flow during exercise causes this type of stress on the artery wall. We call it shear stress. And so this scratching almost of the blood flow on the artery wall would induce the cells of the artery wall, the cells of the lining of the artery, what we call the endothelium, to change their activity, their gene regulation under that environment that would ultimately lead to an anti-atherogenic effect, an effect of countering plaque, heart disease. So it's a really interesting idea. There's some evidence to back it up, but we don't know if that's quite how it works. It's a bit speculative. Another good thing to bear in mind is at the end of the day, what we really care about are events. What is the number of heart attacks and strokes we see on each program in each condition? And these trials aren't long enough to give us that information. So it'll be great in the future if longer trials and larger trials are conducted in this type of population, looking both at the reduction of plaque and the effect on events. Also, note a caution, before you start a new type of physical activity, talk to your doctor, make sure everything is copacetic, especially if you have heart disease. Oh, and another thing that you might have heard about that people might wonder, some studies report that in athletes, especially really intense sports like triathlon and marathons and things like that, athletes that do these sports very frequently and very intensely, we sometimes see higher calcium, higher calcification in their artery walls. So this is kind of a current puzzle, and the effect on actual risk, on actual events, is not entirely understood. So it's something that's under investigation. What about diet? Can diet help us reduce plaque in our artery walls, reverse heart disease? We actually did a deep dive into that question, and I'll link that video right here. And for more details on what causes heart disease, what are the actual causes, we have a whole video on that. I'll link that right here. Check those out. I'll see you next time.